Howdy folks, Dominic here. This episode is a live stream recording about the Art of Kadesh, discussing the temple scenes that Ramesses commissioned to record this conflict. It is our final episode about the battle, which makes up such a prominent part of Ramesses' communication and propaganda, quote-unquote, during the early part of his reign. In this presentation, I cover a lot of material that I wasn't able to include in the narrative, including many of the fun details that appear in the temple scenes, and how they match up with archaeological material about weapons and military technology. Obviously, an audio podcast is not the best way to experience this, but I've included it here for completeness. If you want to see the full video presentation, that is now available on my YouTube channel. Just follow the link in the episode description. Thanks for listening, or watching, and I hope you enjoy. First things first, I'm going to kind of assume that if you're watching this, you're basically familiar with the story of Kadesh, or at the very least, that you've listened to my podcast episode on the history of Egypt. It was number 214 about Kadesh. I am going to recover the basic gist of the battle, but in terms of the hieroglyph texts, Ramesses' narrative of what is happening, I'm going to leave most of that in the podcast, and today we're really going to focus on the visual side of things, which obviously I can't do in the audio version. Classic image by an artist in the early 1900s about Ramesses in battle with his pet lion, who's down here in the center. I think Ramesses would have loved this kind of image of himself, which is why I included it. Just this idea of the pharaoh as the lone hero with his pet lion and his driver trampling everyone before him. He would have been 100% on board with that. All right. So we'll set the context for the art and what is actually happening in these kinds of images from a sort of iconographical and political religious perspective. We'll go through the battle, sort of blow by blow, from the visual side of things. We'll talk a little bit about Muatali and how Ramesses depicts him, his terrible enemy from Hatti. We'll talk about Ramesses' armor, because there's actually some fun little archaeological and artistic stuff to talk about there. And we'll wrap up with a look at the chariots and the chariot battle as a concept, because for the most part, Kadesh probably was mainly a chariot battle. The infantry were involved, especially on the Egyptian side of things, but the Hittite infantry probably weren't as heavily engaged as the Egyptians. At least on the first day, most of the battle probably took place between the chariot divisions, so we'll focus on them. And, maybe in future we can talk about the infantry in the context of other battles of Ramesses II or kings who come later. Very quick geographical context. This is where Kadesh actually is. It's in the southwestern part of what is now the modern nation-state of Syria. At the time, Kadesh is kind of what you'd call a border territory between the Hittite sphere of influence and the Egyptian. Obviously, we like to draw these kind of maps with these blobs, lines on them to give a sense of the territorial control. But for our imagination, it's best to think of these more as areas where the respective kings hold greater or lesser influence. The Egyptian pharaoh holds great influence over Canaan and up into southern Syria. The Hittite king holds great influence over most of Anatolia and into western and central Syria. They're not necessarily governing these territories directly. Well, we can cover that another time. But, it's not quite as clear-cut as these nice painted lines on a map. But Kadesh is a real pain in the neck for both sides, essentially. Before Ramesses II, his own father, Seti, had briefly, at least, captured or reconquered the city, bringing it into the Egyptian sphere of influence. But then, once again, the rulers of Kadesh, who were pretty powerful and influential within their region, even if they couldn't compete with the great empires, they went back to Hatti, essentially, and said, no, we're going to be your friends again. Bollocks to these pharaohs. So that's why Ramesses has to actually come to Kadesh to reassert the authority that his father had had brought back and then had been rejected. Now I'm going to quickly run through the major temples where you'll actually find Kadesh in art, because when you see it in books, it can often be kind of disconnected from the monuments where it actually appears. Probably the one that most people are going to be familiar with and most likely to visit is Abu Simbel, the great temple that Ramesses established early in his reign. We don't have an exact date, but probably around year 5 or slightly earlier is when he starts this monument up. Takes about almost 20 years to build, or I should say carve, really. And then within one of the halls, the main hall just past this doorway, he puts up his one version of the Kadesh battle, and a really large and impressive one appears here. The next one is at the Ramesseum, which is on the west bank of Luxor. This is one of Ramesses' mortuary or memorial temples. He actually has several at different locations, but this is the best preserved and the most famous one, especially for its colossal statues like the younger Memnon, which is now in the British Museum, or the collapsed Ozymandias Colossus that is still at the temple site. I'll probably do a live stream about the colossal statues in the future because there's a lot of really fun history around them. He puts 2 versions of Kadesh here on the first and second pylons, relatively similar in terms of the artistic composition, although they differ in their details. But this is where 2 additional versions of the scenes appear. Then we have Luxor Temple, which is just on the east bank of Luxor, and he decorates these 2 great pylons with the scenes of Kadesh. Doesn't come across quite so well in the broad daylight, but you can see the king's horse here, the king in his chariot, and then this kind of oval shape is where Kadesh itself is centered. I'll come back to these with like line drawings and stuff so we can look at them in more detail. But he really, front and center at Luxor Temple, on the pylons, let's show what I'm communicating, which is my victory, quote unquote, at Kadesh. And then the last and probably the least well known is at Abydos in Ramesses' second memorial temple here. It's just north of the great temple that Seti had constructed and slightly north of Seti's Osirion. This temple is only really recently coming back into public consciousness thanks to reconstruction efforts. As you can see, they've had to do a lot of rebuilding, putting the slabs of stone back into place, putting mud brick layers on top to protect it and reduce erosion. But just from these mounds of debris, you can see how much it was really buried over the years. So this is probably the least well known, but it does have very nice images of the Kadesh battle on the exterior walls, at the back, and on the north side. Again, we'll go through all the imagery in detail. So first things first, let's set a little bit of context. Having been publishing about Ramesses II in the sort of public sphere recently, I've noticed in a lot of comments or things that people sort of say about Ramesses, there's kind of a general trend of anti-Ramesses attitude out in the public discourse. That might just be a symptom of sort of 21st century, mistrust of authoritarian figures, distrust of government. Ramesses is a prime example of that kind of idea. But more importantly, I want to set Ramesses in his context, why his art is the way he is, why he communicates like this, just to give a sense of where the king himself and his artists and people are actually coming from. So first things first, the image of the king as the conquering hero. This is what Ramesses likes to communicate within his art and texts. And that has given many people the impression that he's, supremely arrogant or a braggart or totally full of bollocks. You can't trust him because he's just putting himself forward first and foremost. In reality, this is kind of the narrative that we get from pharaonic art and storytelling. And it's not so much an ego thing as it is a religious and political thing. Because the pharaoh is the protector of the 2 lands, he is the conduit between the divine world and the human. That leads to a sense of the king as a hero, as a great warrior. And this is communicated artistically through figures of the king, like Thutmose IV here in his chariot, trampling their enemies and overpowering them single-handedly. You also get more abstract versions, like the king as a sphinx, human head with his headdress and his elaborate crowns, but the body of a lion with wings folded down along his back, trampling on, in this case, Nubians or Cushites. We'll give a better image here from the line drawings. So this chariot was actually discovered in the tomb of Thutmose IV, and it was published by a chap you may have heard of named Howard Carter, who did this very nice line drawing of it. On the right, we get the image of the king as the lone warrior with his axe and his bow, grabbing his enemies, in this case, Easterners or Asiatics, since they're from like Western Asia. And on the other side, we have the king in his chariot with his bow, aided by the god Montu, who is the god of war from the southern regions. So this kind of communicates the idea of the pharaoh as the hero, and he's assisted by the gods, and he tramples his foes single-handedly. You'll notice there are no other warriors with him, no soldiers, exactly the same way that Ramesses communicates in his narrative. A more famous example is this beautiful painted chest from the tomb, which shows him riding into battle. Now he does have charioteers and soldiers behind him, like these chaps. I really like these little archer dudes. It's a very hard piece to photograph, or at least it was when it was in the old Cairo Museum. So fingers crossed when it's in the Grand Egyptian Museum, we can start photographing it more clearly. But because of the sort of general changes in the later 18th dynasty, especially with Akhenaten and his art, which often shows the king followed by bodyguards and soldiers, we do get a slightly more inclusive, if you will, perspective on the king, where he does actually have his charioteers and his troops. But still, he's the central figure. He goes forth by himself to trample, in this case, Nubians or Cushites. They are basically just watching. They're not involved in the battle, although he does have his war dogs as well to help. But this just communicates that idea that the imagery of the pharaoh functions like this as a warrior hero. So Ramesses is really not unique in the way he's doing this, even if the art that he commissions is on a scale that simply doesn't survive from these earlier rulers. He certainly goes bigger, and his temples have survived better. But what he actually does, who he is as a figure, is not that unique compared to others. And this is Ramesses' own father, Seti, on the walls of Karnak Temple, in this case trampling Bedouin or Shasu from the Sinai and southern Canaanite region. Beautiful full color sort of copy restoration here, where again the king is just the largest figure driving into battle, trampling everyone before him. All right, let's talk about Kadesh. These are the hieroglyphs for it, Kadesh, with the determinative for the hill countries or a foreign land. So Kadesh is how we would generally pronounce it in Egyptological pronunciation. For the Hittites called it Kinza, but the Egyptians seem to have called it Kadesh or Kidshu, something like that. But somehow that's transformed into Kadesh over time. So Kadesh is defined topographically by the Orontes River, which flows south to north. And then at this point, a small stream joins with the Orontes to form a confluence. And Kadesh itself is constructed in the apex of that meeting point. It is on a tell or a hill, an elevated position. This is the modern town surrounded by farmland. Probably not that different from what Ramesses would have seen. It might have been more fortified, as he depicts it. In Abu Simbel, Luxor, and Ramesseum, we get these lovely images where it's shown as a fortified town with, a gate, towers, battlements, crenellations, soldiers, and it's usually got its little name, which is the town of Kadesh. It's also depicted with a river going around it on these images. And this one I often find hard to figure out if it's meant to be a moat or if it's simply the slopes of the hill. I suspect it is the slopes of the hill, but because the paint is gone, we don't know if it's supposed to be blue or green, unfortunately. But he does show it as surrounded by a river on two sides, which suggests that this topography that I've drawn here was the same at that 3,300 years ago. So, Ramesses and the Amun division arrive on the of what is going to be the battle. They cross the Orontes, which is not a large river. It's relatively narrow and at certain areas quite fordable, quite shallow. So it can be crossed on foot, which is obviously not the case with the Nile for most of its length. So the Egyptian soldiers probably found this a slightly unusual river, like not that impressive compared to what's back home, but they could at least cross it on foot, which would have meant their advance towards the city was not slowed terribly by the approach to the city. Along the way, they stop and they meet two Shasu Bedouin, who famously in the story tell Ramesses that the Hittites are about 10 days' march to the north at what is now Aleppo. The king thinks, I've managed to reach Kadesh without Muwatalli knowing. I've stolen a march. Great, we can gather our forces all together, begin our siege, and then see what happens when the Hittites approach, if they approach. So then Ramesses carries on, and they set up their camp. And he specifically tells us in the texts that he sets up his camp to the west of Kadesh, which, everything you're going to see on these little maps is, sort of educated guess based on Ramesses' description. We don't know exactly where the camp was. It could have been further west, could have been further north, or further south. These are just for guidelines only. But he sets up his camp, and we get these lovely images on most of the scenes of Ramesses sitting on his throne within his sort of tent with his fan bearers and his bodyguard of Sherdin and Egyptians. And then he receives the unfortunate news that, in fact, the Hittites are not 10 days away. In fact, they are much closer. But we'll get to that in a moment. The Egyptian camp itself is often depicted in quite large and impressive detail. It's very hard to photograph, especially at Abu Simbel, so I'll work from the line drawings mostly. One thing I do want to highlight is this little enclosure, which seems to be the tented enclosure of the king. We have these little falcons or birds with sun discs adoring the cartouche of the ruler. Let's go to line drawing, much better. And you get people praising the little tent of the king. It's all very abstract, very iconographical, but it gives you the sense that the king set up his pavilion in a sort of enclosed space within the larger camp. In fact, should we go back, you can see these little semicircle. These probably would have been painted back in the day, like cowhide or leather with little adornments, but it gives the idea that this is a fortified enclosure. We have all the sort of bustle that you'd expect from a camp. We have cattle and oxen, we have chariots and carts being brought in. One guy over here on the left, if you can see where my mouse is, seems to be a soldier who's like injured himself, and a doctor is attending to him or helping him with something. All these really cool little details that we often get in Egyptian art, especially from the New Kingdom. Some really good examples come from the tomb of Horemheb at Saqqara, where we see them setting up a tented encampment, including this little sort of 4-roomed pavilion. It's got a doorway. It's got storage rooms with, jugs and furniture. They sweep out the sand, and then they sprinkle down water to keep the dust tamped down. And then you get little guys bringing water pots and jugs. Horemheb's tomb is really great for this kind of imagery of setting up the camp, with multiple little tents supported by these tall poles. The tents themselves are probably leather or sort of a canvas linen. And we also get cool little images, like I really like this little guy of just a bored charioteer. He's parked his vehicle, it's supported now on a stick, the horses are gone, and he's just waiting for his next instructions, and he's just hanging out. It's good. So the Egyptian camp is set up west of Kadesh, but they learn that, oh my gosh, the Hittites are actually here. This is one of Ramesses' depictions of Muwatalli, or as he calls him, the fallen one of the Hittites. By the time Ramesses starts to receive the news, the Hittites are already on the move. They've launched their attack. Clearly, Muwatalli has intended to make a surprise attack on the Egyptian army before it is able to fortify, get settled, and concentrate their forces. We get a very nice depiction of the Hittites at Abydos, which is one of Ramesses' memorial temples. They sort of march in these long, identical groups. They've always got sort of a shaved forehead with hair hanging down the back, mullet style, essentially. But they also have things like their four-wheeled sort of storage wagons, essentially, drawn by horses or donkeys in this case over here, and oxen, bringing the supplies to the Hittite camp. Some of them carry them on their shoulders. Really large-scale, impressive depictions of the enemy forces and how they're setting themselves up. We don't get a specific image of the enemy camp like we do with the Egyptians, but at least we get some glimpses of these sort of what they're using, these kind of four-wheeled wagons, which obviously those are not that well attested for the Bronze Age. So it's quite interesting to see them here that, yeah, they actually were using four-wheeled technology with various animals to pull them as part of their supply train. So this is at the Ramesseum, grand and impressive versions of Ramesses seated on his throne in his camp, as somebody brings the news to him that unfortunately the Hittites are here and you are in great danger. This is a sort of color copy that was made by Champollion in the 1800s. It's from Abu Simbel. Back then, in about 1835, Abu Simbel had been largely buried under sand until Belzoni visited and cleared it, which was really great because it meant that the inner halls preserved a lot of their paint because they were basically covered over. There was no moisture or air to erode them. Unfortunately, once Belzoni cleared the temple, the colors inevitably slowly started to fade with the change in atmosphere. And then the legions of tourists that have been visiting the temple for the past 200 years have further and further degraded the paint. So now it's all gone at Abu Simbel. But Champollion and a couple of others made really beautiful copies of some of the scenes. And the copies that the different artists made do agree with one another. So we get a sense of what it was supposed to look like. A lot of blues and yellows, kind of these royal colors that the kings use. Think of that mask of Tutankhamun, classic imagery. Deep red, reddish brown for the Egyptian forces, including the Sheridan, which is kind of interesting because, the Sheridan probably come from more Mediterranean east or west. So it's interesting that they're depicted the same because they're part of Ramesses' bodyguard. We also get two Hittite scouts who are being beaten for information, interrogated. This is another chapter in the story where after making his camp, Ramesses' soldiers capture two more Hittite scouts, and they learn about the terrible threat that is unfolding. And these poor dudes are just getting beaten for the rest of eternity. They appear on most of the temple scenes, so Ramesses really wanted to hammer home how we interrogated these guys harshly. All right, one really cool detail that is not very well known for ancient Egyptian military art is horse riders. These little guys do appear. They are not cavalry in the sense of knights or battalions of horse riders moving together. They only ever appear by themselves individually. They are armed, so they carry bows, they have quivers on their backs. So they seem to be like armed messengers or scouts who are capable of defending themselves, but they seem to be moving individually rather than as groups. So you can imagine them kind of ranging around the campaign zone, either by themselves on the day-to-day or perhaps in small groups who then spread out across a region to do the scouting. But in this case, once Ramesses receives the news of the impending attack, he sends out riders to gather the rest of his troops, the army battalions who are still marching along the road. And the hieroglyphs, at these different scenes describe them as, hurrying along the road in order to bring the division of Ptah or the division of Sutek, that kind of thing. We also have them at Luxor Temple, very, very nice version. This chap here, again, he's got a quiver on his back and he's clutching a bow while he holds the reins for his horse, and he seems to be goading him with a stick. One interesting feature that I'll go back to is that they often depict their horse riders kind of riding back on the haunches. Not all the time. Sometimes you get sort of mid ones. But this seems to be a stance that is more commonly associated with riding. So that raises the question of whether the artists simply don't know how a horse rider is supposed to look and they're used to drawing donkeys, or whether, given that they don't have stirrups or saddles yet, they're still using a more donkey style form of riding on horseback. I'm not an equestrian, so I don't know if you can even do that or if it's practical. We really don't have any information about how exactly they are riding, whether this is an artistic error or whether it's actually how. The vizier, who hurries along in a chariot, he's not going on horseback. He's got a prestige vehicle, probably his own personal chariot that he owns and pays for, hurrying along the road as well. And the hieroglyph captions describe like the vizier hurries along to bring the troops of Pharaoh who are still upon the road. Really cool little details, often overlooked. Just you get a sense of the sort of the panic that is in the camp at that moment. And Ramesses immediately says, okay, send out messengers. We need our troops here. Hurry them along the road. Go. But then the attack begins. So the Hittites have set up north of Kadesh, and they launch their force, which seems to be primarily chariots, towards the south. At this point, the second army division is approaching the river and just crossing over. They do so, and they seem to be somewhere in this region south of Kadesh when the Hittites begin their assault. The enemy crosses the river and basically careens into the Ra division as they are going along. And this is my fabulous little artistic graphic. Clearly, we're going for some Invicta or Kings and Generals style production values. This appears at Abu Simbel, and the text sort of describes it in quite grandiose terms, where Ramesses is surprisingly open and forthright about this particular calamity and this failure. He says that the division of Ra were marching, they were not prepared for fighting, and the enemy attacked them in the middle. And so his troops just gave up. They ran away before the enemy. And this obviously would be a major theme in Ramesses' narrative, that his troops were unable to resist the enemy and he had to do everything himself. We take that with several grains of salt, but it does come across in the text. We don't actually see the attack on Ra division in the art because, of course, that is a moment of defeat, however localized. And the Egyptians do not like to show that in their temples. Not because, well, I guess partly because, it's embarrassing or shameful and they prefer to advertise victories, but also because the ancient Egyptian worldview has the logic that if you carve something into stone or if you put it in writing or in art, it has its own magical reality. So whatever you're going to show in art, it needs to be something that you are comfortable with that thing becoming supernaturally real. With that in mind, whenever you look at the art of any battle, not just Ramesses, you will very, very rarely, I actually can't think of a proper example, you will very rarely see an Egyptian soldier dying to an enemy. 99.99% of the time, it is the Egyptian soldiers killing their foes. And we get this in the chariot battle, where the Egyptian charioteers are on the left here, forward, and they're just shooting the Hittite charioteers down, basically. Almost, the arrows pierce their horses, they tumble over their carts, and they're just going down. While these guys, totally fine. Again, this is what I was talking about with the color copies based on Abu Simbel. We get a sense of the Hittites, who are presented as basically kind of more like Indo-European, Caucasian, if you will, given that they're coming from Anatolia. They wear sort of top knots or long hair flowing down the back. Again, all very stereotypical in the way that Egyptian art is. They don't tend to show individuals so much. It's just copy-paste different versions of Hittites. But there are 3 men to a chariot, which is something Ramesses mentions in the texts. and they have their distinctive shields, which are kind of figure eight kind of thing. Have you ever watched that movie Troy? Achilles actually carries a shield basically of this design. The way they're drawn here seems to be almost like they're kind of wicker work, or perhaps covered in scales of bronze. We can come back to that a bit later. But we do know that from archaeological remains found at Ramesses, which is the great city Ramesses established in northern Egypt, archaeologists actually did find a stone mold that you would use in bronze working, which is in the shape of a Hittite shield. So basically you pour the molten metal into this mold to give you a solid bronze shield of that design, which is really cool. I'll probably do a live stream about Ramesses at some point in the future, because it's a very visual thing to discuss. But yeah, the Hittites seem to have carried these figure eight shields, but also rectangular ones, as we'll see through the art generally. Anyway, this is from Abydos, where we get this really cool sort of topography of like the river Orontes, which cuts right through halfway through the battle scenes, but also divides it into two different phases, where on the left we have the aftermath of the battle, but on the right we get these charioteers driving forward, to, in this case, the Hittites charging at their enemy. Here's a better example. You have the masses of Hittite infantry hanging out near Kadesh, but then the charioteers are just going full tilt towards the enemy. In this case would be towards the Egyptian camp. So Ra division scatters. They are out of the picture, at least for the first day. We assume that they regrouped after the battle, and Ramesses does say that the soldiers trickled back into camp shamefully. But then the Hittite chariots, they don't stop to destroy Ra division as far as Ramesses describes it. He basically says that they swept through Ra division, scattered it, completely obliterated its combat effectiveness, disorganized, disrupted. They're running for the hills. But then the chariots just carried on and swept north towards the Egyptian camp. They strike the Egyptian camp itself on the west side, as Ramesses describes it. And by this point, the Egyptians have probably set up a basic perimeter, like a fence or those shields that we saw at Abu Simbel. They've started to fortify, but clearly they're not fully encamped yet, because there are still 3 divisions upon the road. Either it's not clear whether they intended to have a single large camp for all the divisions, in which case that perimeter would have been much larger than the Amun division could defend by itself, or whether each division was going to make its own camp around Kadesh. I suspect the latter, because you'd probably want to have, a divisions cutting off access points to the city if you're intending to lay siege, but that's me speculating. So the Hittites burst into the camp, and we in the art, which is cool. Again, it's always focused on the Egyptians, overpowering them, but we do at least get a sense of the Hittites crashing in. Like, for instance, the shield barrier here, the shield itself is upside down, suggesting that it's been broken. And these particular charioteers are actually sons of Ramesses II, princes who are getting away from the battle, staying away from the fighting. But then you have a 3-man Hittite chariot up here in the top, crashing into the camp from the western side. We get it also really nicely illustrated at Luxor Temple, where they're sort of, again, they're plowing through. The shields stop abruptly, suggesting that this is the point where they've broken through the barrier, and the charioteers are driving in. Notably, though, the Egyptians are already fighting back and starting to drag them from their carts. This is a Hittite chariot with supposed to have 3 men, but now it's got 2, and they've dragged one down to attack them. These horses are completely separated from their cart because the Egyptians are already overpowering them. In reality, it was probably chaos, essentially. You have these chariots attacking a fortified enclosure, which is not the ideal territory for chariots. They thrive in the open battlefield. They need maneuverability. Attacking a camp is not the best use of chariots. They're not heavily armed knights or anything that can just plow right through. They need space. So it's an interesting wrinkle in Mu'atali's strategy that he does actually attack the camp with chariots. But this is what Ramesses shows. And we get the Egyptians, mustering a counterattack on their two-man chariots, driving forward towards the enemy. So the battle is now starting to unfold around the Egyptian camp. At this point, Muwatalli supposedly sends a second wave of troops. Fairly logical. You can't rely on one throw of the dice for a single attack. So the second wave, who probably set off soon after the first one, giving them a little bit of distance and space, come in to reinforce the initial attack and to provide extra ammunition, as it were. In terms of numbers, we don't have a specific set of numbers for the Hittite forces, although Ramesses' captions on the temple art do include groups that he numbers as like 18,000 men here, 19,000 men there. And then within the text itself, he describes there being 2,500 enemy chariots, each one having 3 men. So that would give you another 7,500 men. Do we accept those numbers as gospel? No, but it's not impossible that Muwatalli could muster a force this large. In the text, Ramesses describes that Muwatalli gathers vassals and allies from every corner of his empire and brings them to Kadesh. Now, whether that is just rhetoric to amplify Ramesses' victory or not, we'll probably never know for sure. But at the very least, the Hittiteologists or Hittite scholars that I've read, figures like Trevor Bryce and Richard Beale, both of whom have written about the military, both of their comments on the Kadesh battle say that it's feasible that Muwatalli could bring this many troops. They're probably not all professionals, a lot of levy troops at best. But at least from what I've read among the Hittite scholars, it's not impossible that the Hittite kings could muster that kind of force. But, take it with a grain of salt. And starts fighting. But then he's saved dramatically by the arrival of his 5th battalion, who are called the Na'arin. Na'arin is actually a word, or I should say a sort of an Asiatic word that seems to mean like youths or elites, which is kind of similar to how the Egyptians have their Neferu, which is the youths or the elite troops. Ramesses describes that these troops the Na'arin had come from Amaru, which is to the west on the coast of Syria, and they seem to have been his kind of relief force that he had sent by another road in order to arrive at Kadesh from a different direction. Maybe they were gathering allies and vassals along the way, mustering additional forces to bring to the battle, but they, according to the narrative, arrive just in time to save the Egyptians from the Hittite attack. These are the Na'arit version of them, very finely carved, in this kind of very crisp style, which you don't get so much at Abu Simbel or the other ones. I think this is the best version. But they march in nice, tidy ranks. They carry things like the Kopesh sword. They also carry one-handed axes. And they probably had, at least in other depictions, they carry spears or bows. So, they're armed with a variety of weapons, but they're coming forth en masse, and they all carry these very large shields. There is also a chariot force accompanying them, which again, I think gives credence to the idea that they're not just Egyptians, they are also troops from Byblos or Canaan generally, like Tyre, Ashkelon, that kind of region, gathered up as vassals and brought by the Western Road. Hieroglyph captions describe them as, the arrival of the Na'arin troop from the land of Amaru. So they've taken this western route. And they come in on the western side where they find the enemy attacking the Egyptian camp. And of course, they probably somewhat realistically crash into the rear of the Hittite enemy and begin to scatter them, which would be terrifying. This is a very nice depiction of them from Abu Simbel, but as you can see, it's just not as finely carved. The rock here is sandstone, so it doesn't hold details quite as nicely as the top quality limestone of Abydos. The line drawings that were made by people like Champollion and Rossellini, these ones they didn't bother to do in color, which is a shame, but they did include some of the details that were painted, like the eyes, which are now, they were painted on mostly. And they often include these kind of tassels on like their headdresses or their kind of leather caps, if you will, which again might give credibility to the idea that some of them are Canaanite, Syrian soldiers gathered up and not just Egyptian. So they come in, the Hittites start to flee because the power of the pharaoh is overwhelming them and they are unable to resist his forces. They start to move back towards the river, and we get these beautiful images of the Hittites sort of tumbling into the Orontes, trying to get away from the Egyptian counterattack. And in these cases, they have to be physically riverbank from the other side by their comrades who are waiting. It's just kind of a grandiose picture of the Egyptian victory generally. Again, going back to that idea of you can't show the deaths of Egyptians in temple art. So it's always just a massacre of the enemy. But these little details of them tumbling into the river and having to be rescued are quite fun. Especially these guys who are basically, they're dead. They're just floating in the waters of the Orontes, unable to rise again. For the Egyptians, that would be quite an unpleasant way to die from their perspective. The underworld texts of the time often categorize the ones who have drowned as a very sad, lowly part of the underworld. And obviously, given that these are enemies, they're especially sad and lowly. So they just float unloved in the waters. One of the really fun details is from the Ramesses, or from a couple of the temple scenes actually, where we get this guy who's being held upside down and sort of shaken about by his comrades. According to the hieroglyphs, this is the ruler of Aleppo, or the wretched prince of Aleppo, as Ramesses calls him. This is the place where Ramesses thought the Hittites were camping to the north, about 10 days away. The ruler of Aleppo was a Hittite vassal, had been for generations, so he was really properly an enemy, part of the enemy camp. But according to Ramesses' narrative, or the art, this particular ruler jumped into the water, had to be rescued, and was kind of so waterlogged or had swallowed so much water that they had to turn him over and shake him about to get the water out. And the hieroglyphs actually describe him as the wretched ruler of Aleppo being emptied of water, which is quite fun. This is from Luxor. Luxor is probably the least well studied of the temple scenes because it's been a tourist destination for such. Nobody's really done the epigraphy on the pylons, so we only have these lower quality images. But I really like this guy. These charioteers who are fleeing into the citadel of Kadesh as Ramesses over to the right is, launching his attack, his counterattack. And the artist has shown them sort of disappearing into the gate or behind the walls, communicating the fact that as the Hittites are fleeing, at least some of them, perhaps the contingent that was actually from Kadesh, retreat into the city itself. And then we get really fun details like this, which is in the center here, we have Egyptian soldiers, an Egyptian soldier spearing a Hittite right through the collarbone or through the neck, potentially going all the way through his torso. A very unpleasant way to go. I think there was a character on Game of Thrones who died like that, and it was really bloody and brutal. We also have two of these guys with the little caps with the horns and their big round shields. These are the Sherden warriors. This is one of them from Total War Pharaoh. And they are cutting off the hands of their enemy in order to count the enemy dead. We know from Egyptian texts, like the biography of Ahmose, the son of Ibana, that Egyptian soldiers would cut off the hands of a foe and present them at the end of the battle to show that they had individually killed an enemy warrior, and they would be rewarded for it, kind of like a battlefield bounty, if you will. So quite bloody and brutal, and he's kind of going right through the wrist with his straight-bladed sword, often called a Nawe type sword, speculated to be. But these fun little details show up in the battle art. So the first day ends with the Hittites retreating, supposedly, but we do get a second. We don't hear that much about it in the narrative. It's like paragraphs compared to the 50 paragraphs of the first day. But basically, the Egyptians and the Hittites Their forces much more orderly and tidy, and they clash somewhere just south of or near Kadesh. Again, Ramesses really doesn't give many details on this second day, which is a shame. He just tells us that it happened. And they basically fight each other to a stalemate. This battle probably did include a lot more infantry, but you can imagine it was primarily a slogging match around the river ford. I doubt that either side really had much room to maneuver, because it was in the Hittites' best interests to hold that ford so that the Egyptians couldn't come around on them. But it was in the Egyptians' best interests to not let the Hittites manage to do what they had done again by encircling them. Ramesses again describes it very briefly, and as usual, he focuses on himself as the warrior hero, fitting within that tradition, where he and his cobra, Uraeus, that sort of that golden cobra that sits on the front of his crown. In battle texts, we hear about that Uraeus sort of spitting fire at the enemies, like shooting them with lasers, kind of War of the Worlds style, is how I imagine it. But he describes that as the sort of killing his foes single-handedly, as usual. He barely mentions his soldiers at all. But again, that is part of the tradition of the warrior hero, which is the pharaoh. By this point, strategically, we can figure out that other divisions like Ptah would have been reaching the battlefield. So at this point, the Hittites are probably starting to lose their advantage. They might still have greater numbers if we take Ramesses' suggestion at face value, but they've lost the element of surprise. They've clearly, on the first day, their attacks scattered the Ra division but did not destroy it. They probably inflicted quite a few casualties at the camp, but not necessarily that many, given that the chariots were fighting within an enclosed space, not ideal for their use. It's possible that by this point, the Hittites did actually have something of a reasonably bloody nose. I think the fact that Muwatalli pulls off a surprise attack is certainly very admirable and should be recognized, but people often give a little bit too much weight to that aspect, because when you start to work through the logistics of what Muwatalli is actually trying to do, to sort of send this chariot force to the Egyptian camp and presumably capture or kill Ramesses, or at least force him off the battlefield, force him to flee. He doesn't achieve that. He scatters one army division, Ra, but they're not dead. They can regroup. He kills a few of the Amun division at the Egyptian camp, but then his forces are pushed back, potentially in quite a costly manner. So I think at this point, the battle really reaches essentially a stalemate. The Egyptians hold their own on day one, which is nothing to be sneezed at. But on day two, neither side can gain advantage. They're stuck, basically. And so eventually they withdraw. We get this tale in the narrative that Ramesses receives a peace overture from Muwatalli, who says, "Clearly, you're the greater king. You're the very best. Let's both withdraw and call it a day." We don't really believe that. Muwatalli might very well have sent a message saying, "We're not achieving anything here. Let's both just step back with our honor intact, and we'll sort this out at a later date or by other means." But that's how the second day, and thus the Battle of Kadesh, actually ends, basically in a stalemate. So what happens after? Well, as I sort of showed you earlier, we have this image of the Egyptian soldiers from texts and art cutting off the hands of their enemies. And we get the best example of this from Abydos, where you have an enormous figure of the king himself seated upon his chariot. The chariot is facing this way. Here's his foot. He's perching on the rim of the chariot, of the cart, and facing backwards, so his horses are behind him, using it like a portable throne, if you will. And then rank upon rank of enemy prisoners come forth, and Egyptian scribes deposit hands. Piles and piles of enemy hands. Count and tabulate, and the court officials, raise their hands in the which is dua or praise. So, this is kind of like a large hieroglyph praising the king for his great victory, while the artists are making the scribes are making their notes of how many are dead, how many have we managed to kill, and. It's quite grisly when you really think about it, but they're clutching the hands by the thumbs in order to deposit them on the battlefield, and the pile just grows higher and higher. And you also get a sense that at some point the sculptor loses interest a little bit in what he's doing. In the center of the pile, they're very nicely carved hands, very well defined. By the time he reaches the top, he's kind of just chiseling these thin little fingers. Can't be bothered. The light is failing. He's tired. He wants to go home. I like little details like this where you can track the attitude and the exhaustion of the artist as they go. Just tabulating the results. Scribe, he's got it's either a scroll or like a wooden palette kind of thing, and he's writing with his reed pen to tabulate it up. We get the same thing at Abu Simbel, although the piles are much smaller. It's clumps that are carved on the walls, but again, the same praise. This time, instead, we get hech, which is, or ches, which is like praise, another form of praise. And then we get long lines of prisoners coming before the king. So Muatali, the wretched enemy from Hati. He does appear in the temple art, although always in a very consistent fashion. Here is the figure from Abydos. Naturally, because fate is fickle, we've lost the upper blocks, which would have actually shown his head and his upper body. But we know it's him because of the hieroglyphs here, which are Pacher and Cheta, which is the fallen one of Hati. He stands in his chariot. You'll notice that his troops are behind him. They are looking backwards behind them. The figure of Ramesses would have been to the right of this, charging towards the enemy, and they are moving away from Ramesses, which is quite a consistent part of the depiction. At Abydos, we get that version. At Luxor, the same, with the same orientation. At Ramesseum, we get the same. He's moving away from the king's chariot who is charging. Every time you see him, the Hittite is always moving in the opposite direction of where Ramesses is charging. Because, again, this is temple art. It is supposed to communicate an eternal image of victory, one that has its own magical properties because it is carved in stone in art. The Hittite enemy will always be a loser. He will always be running away because now it is carved in stone. And, you know, when you think about it in sort of historiographical terms, that is kind of the image that has survived. We don't have very many images of Muatali, or any as far as I'm aware, maybe one. We have more images of Muatali from Ramesses temples than we do actually from Hati. So credit where credit is due. The pharaoh did win that particular aspect of it. But to go back to the point, Muatali is contrasted very strongly with Ramesses, the warrior hero. Ramesses is always the largest figure in any section, just like every other pharaoh before, and he's always riding alone, full tilt into the enemy. Muatali, by contrast, is always very small, and he's always surrounded by troops. He's not a brave warrior. He's not a hero. He needs to be protected by his bodyguard because he can't do it on his own. And he's always turning away from the pharaoh. He's always cringing and fearful, which is what the hieroglyph captions here describe him as. They say he's the fallen one of Hati, turning away in fear of his majesty, Ramesses. So this all kind of wraps up together in that temple art, that image of victory, which is so important to both the Egyptian attitude towards carving these scenes and for Ramesses himself. This is a much better illustration of what I was talking about. Ramesses, very large, in control by himself, surrounded by his troops, fleeing. One little detail that I do want to highlight is just this section. It comes from Luxor, and it shows these little dudes. And at a glance, they don't look like much. But as we will eventually see under the days of Ramesses III, at least 3 of these chaps wearing outfits that are very similar to some of the Sea Peoples groups, like the Peliset and the Luca. Now, Ramesses specifically identifies at least a couple of groups who were Sea Peoples groups who were involved in Kadesh. The first was the Sherden, which was his warriors with the horned helmets. But he also mentions that Muatali had brought the Luka, who are one of these sea peoples groups. And he mentions others from the Anatolian coast, including people like the Dardanians, or who come from the region which is now Troy. This seems to be Ramesses' version of these Anatolian or Eastern Mediterranean peoples who are part of Muatali's great confederation, as it were. All right, so as sort of starting to wrap up now, we have a couple of little things I want to talk about, like Ramesses' armor. This is something that hasn't survived so well today, but thanks to those color copies, we do have an idea of what it was supposed to look like. The armor is always painted onto the temple walls, so naturally it's faded away now, which is most unfortunate. But at least from the Ramesseum, we have an image of the king seemingly wearing a long coat of basically scale armor, like mail. And this is actually attested archaeologically. We have these sort of bronze scales that turn up at Egyptian settlements like Ramesses and Malkata. They've also turned up in the Aegean in Greece, like this particular example on the left, which comes from a place called Kanakia and is actually stamped with a cartouche of Ramesses, beloved of Amun, probably Ramesses II, potentially Ramesses III. But at the very least, it's Ramessid bronze scale armor that is being used within this region. We also have originally it was complete set from the tomb of Tutankhamun, which, based on the reconstruction, seems to have been worn like this, kind of a long thigh-length cuirass, which covers the king, but also gives him a great deal of flexibility. And this is something that is kind of important to remember with the way they're thinking about their armor. The Egyptian nobility and the pharaohs, the elites, they are first and foremost chariot archers. They're not so much melee troops. They prefer to fight at a distance at high speed with bow and arrow. Armor like this gives you a lot more flexibility in turning your body back and forth, aiming your bow, aiming your weapon, than something like a leather or bronze cuirass would. It still provides a great deal of protection, especially because most of the scales are made of bronze. But you can sort of think of it more like snake scales as rather than rhinoceros armor, if that makes sense. But it's a cool thing that once you start to think about how these pieces of armor are actually put together and how they function, how that ties in with the way that they're actually fighting on the battlefield. They don't just want protection, they want maneuverability and flexibility. And it's so wonderful that we have examples like this from the tomb of Tutankhamun, where we can actually reconstruct it and say, this is how it works. Now let's talk about the chariots. They are, the glittering sports cars of the battlefield. They are the most prominent part of Egyptian royal battle imagery for most of the New Kingdom, I should say. I was about to say all of history, but obviously they turn up around 1550 BCE. Anyway, Ramesses gives us really nice images of his chariots and others from the battles. He depicts his chariot quite consistently as this sort of gold and blue affair with multiple quivers for javelins and bows, or arrows, I should say. And he's always got this lion-shaped quiver on the side of his chariot. Whether it's actually a quiver in the shape of a lion or just a lion adornment on the side of his chariot, we can't quite say for sure. But it's so consistent in his art that I suspect this is what his chariot actually did look like, that it had these multiple quivers strapped to it, and it had a big golden lion on the side, which is grandiose in all the most fabulous ways. But more importantly, we have an image of Ramesses' driver. His name was Menna or Menenna. It's spelled in the Egyptian as M-N-N and then Aleph or A. So it's either Menna or Menenna. But he is the shield bearer of the king, which it seems to function as the driver as well. He's holding the reins, but he's also got the shield to protect the ruler or the warrior. And he appears in the narrative of Kadesh, where Ramesses uses his driver Menna to sort of, as kind of like a straw man, where in the midst of the battle, Menna speaks to the Ramesses and he says, "Great king, we've been abandoned by our troops. Why are you still fighting? We should flee. The enemy is all around us." And So naturally, Ramesses is able to respond to that and say, Mena, don't be a coward. My troops might have abandoned me, but I'm not going to abandon them. I'm a hero. I'll win. So even though the hieroglyphs in the art don't label this guy as Mena, the fact that this is the driver of the chariot tells us that it is Mena. We also have the chariot team, whom Ramesses does name, and he really loves these horses. He mentions them specifically in the battle narrative multiple times. Then the names of the two horses were Victory in Waset and Moot is Content. And at the end of the battle narrative, he singles out these horses and he says, all of my troops abandoned me. Everyone left me alone, except for my horses. They were loyal. They stuck by me. And in recognition, I, the pharaoh, will always go to the stables to feed them myself whenever I'm in the palace. So it's kind of this wonderful detail where Ramesses really liked his horses. Moot is Content and Victory in Waset. And they're consistently named on all of the temple reliefs. So I think we can take that at his word. He really liked those two animals, which is cool. As for the chariots themselves, we have several examples do survive from tombs, especially in the 18th dynasty. This is from a high-ranking courtier named Yuya, who was the great-great-uncle of Tutankhamun, probably. He was the father-in-law of Amenhotep III, who might be Tutankhamun's grandfather. Yuya, his tomb, was discovered intact in the Valley of the Kings, and he had this beautiful chariot, adorned with gold, made of high-quality cedar wood. You know, basically the ancient equivalent of like a Maserati, I guess, or whatever sports car you especially like. Cool details that it has, like the body is covered with leather, much lighter, obviously, than wood, but still providing a good deal of protection. And they even have tires. They use these raw hide tires, which they stretch around the circumference of the wheel. Pardon me. And then they wet it to make it, and as it dries, it constricts. So it goes tightly around the wheel and provides cushioning and thus more stability for the rider, which is just a really cool detail. You don't really think of chariots having tires, but they do. At least the Egyptian ones do. Someone did in the 90s, this was around 2013. They tested making a chariot by Egyptian methods, and they did like sort of speed tests on them on open field. And granted, with one driver instead of two riders, they could achieve like 24 miles an hour. So these things could actually go at a reasonable clip if they're in ideal territory, which is nice and flat and sandy. Assuming that there's two riders on every chariot, maybe it's a little bit slower, but at least through experimentation, we have figured out, well, not we, but scientists have figured out that these things are relatively swift when you really get them going. So the chariot battle could have been happening at high speed, which naturally probably caused all kinds of problems for the warriors themselves. The faster it's going, the faster they're turning, the more likely things are to careen or crash over one another. In the right circumstances, the chariot battle could have been an absolute mess on the field. And in the aftermath, there would have been war carts broken and strewn everywhere, injured horses, unfortunately. But chariots can go quite fast in ideal conditions. So you can imagine that this kind of running battle that Ramesses describes around the camp could have been quite dramatic. Playing it again. So Ramesses in his chariot himself is always the dominant figure in the temple art, because that's the way the iconography of Egyptian battle scenes goes. We get, again, this glorious figure of the king with his chariot. The chariot body, it's always got these multiple quivers and his lion-shaped adornment, and then the enemy collapses before him. And again, this is the color copy of this very scene from here. This is what Priest Daven was copying when he made this. So this is what he originally looked like. This little detail on the chariot I wanted to highlight because that is real. We have that physically from the tomb of Tutankhamun. It goes on top of the yoke, running up the center line between the two horses, and it's hard to see in this photo, but it's adorned with a scarab with two wings holding a sun disk, which in this case is part of the royal name of Tutankhamun, but presumably Ramesses would have had his own version, maybe adorned with his cartouches or similar iconography. But at least we can say that physically, these little details seem to be accurate to what is preserved archaeologically, which is really cool. The Hittite chariots, as Ramesses says, are always 3 to a unit, 3 to a chariot. And he describes there being 2,500 chariots in the enemy force. That is not impossible if Muwatalli did indeed gather allies or vassals from every corner of his empire. But it's quite unlikely that they were all fighting as a single body at one point, at one location, because 2,500 chariots would cover a huge amount of ground. You know, every pair of horses needs a great deal of space. They need room to maneuver. Even if the full Hittite complement had 2,500, it's quite unlikely that all of them were engaged at a single time. But this is what Ramesses tells us. Artistic reconstructions by Angus McBride, kind of one of the greats of sort of archaeological reconstruction art. Going from Ramesses scenes, you know, the shaved forehead, the long mullet down the back, figure 8 shield, armored horses with the scale mail, and scale mail on the troops themselves, 3 men to a chariot, much heavier. Wanted to highlight this little bit because it's small captions about the Hittite forces, which give a sense of who supposedly the Egyptians killed on the battlefield, some of whom were quite high-ranking. In this scene, for example, we have a reference to the chief of the bodyguard of the Wretched One of Hati, which is Muwatalli's chief bodyguard, essentially, and also a shield bearer for Muwatalli. You know, they have their names and stuff, which, if we take that at Ramesses' word, you know, maybe the Egyptians captured these high-ranking Hittites and they said, you know, who are you? What's your rank? And maybe they ransomed them back, or maybe they took them prisoner. We really don't know. Or maybe they did actually kill them on the battlefield and then identified the body later as, you know, hey, that's Gilbert Tusa. He's the shield bearer, so-and-so. Ramesses includes a long list of these individuals that he supposedly defeats, including people like Muwatalli's own brother, apparently. And when we think about the organization of these ancient armies, that's not totally unreasonable. You know, they're not functioning like a modern nation state army where it's all kind of one force loyal to the governing body. In the ancient world, kind of similar to the medieval, you probably have more retainers and retinues following individual nobles. Even if they're all under the command of the great king or the pharaoh, you would still have a great many high-ranking aristocrats within these forces, and they all want the prestige and the splendor and the glory of the victory. So it's really not outside of the realm of possibility that many high-ranking Hittites did get involved in the first wave or second wave of the battle, and many of them might have died. It's possible. One other detail here is that this particular wall does still preserve some of the paint, like red on the horses, the nice blue on the Hittites themselves. Blue, quite an expensive dye to produce in the ancient world, so it's communicating their wealth, you know, how these are high-ranking individuals who are fallen amongst the enemy because of the Egyptian victory. And then, again, Angus McBride gives the best version of it, which is a dramatic chariot clash between the two sides. The Hittites with their 3 men, sort of heavier war carts, and then the Egyptians driving forward. Ramesses would have loved this, so it's a nice way to close out. One version of this battle scene as a really nice way to show how you can actually read Egyptian royal art. So you might have heard that when you're reading hieroglyphs, one of the best ways to find out which direction you're supposed to read the hieroglyph is check for the direction which, like, the birds or the humans are looking. If they are looking towards one direction, you look towards their face and you read from that case. In this example, we have Ramesses sitting here. He's the dominant figure and he faces this direction. So we are reading from right to left. We can also, to some degree, read the battle in that direction and even kind of match it up geographically with what actually happened at Kadesh. So, for example, Ramesses tells us that the Egyptian camp was set up on the west side of Kadesh. So, at Abu Simbel and at all of the temples, to the best of my memory, you will find the Egyptian camp slightly west of center, according to the local orientation. The king, whose tent seems to be in the eastern quadrant, if you're going by that, he appears to the eastern side. The first phase of the battle, which is the Hittite attack, that unfolds east of the tent, or southeast, more accurately. So it first appears here, and this kind of starts our narrative. And then the Narin troops approach from the west. So they physically appear on the western side of the scene. And this is kind of the first layer of the battle scene at Abu Simbel. It's divided into these two horizontal registers. And then if you move next to the upper level, you get Kadesh as your orientation point, just for geography. Ramesses, who is camped west of Kadesh, launches his counterattack from the west of Kadesh, so he appears to the west of the battle. Muwatalli, who's here, is described in the text as being to the east of Kadesh itself, so he appears on the eastern half of the wall. And then the battle continues to unfold. Egyptian troops, like the Patah division, they are approaching from the east of the Egyptian camp, so they start to show up. And in the final aftermath of the battle, southeast of the Egyptian camp, roughly, Ramesses holds his little ceremony of counting enemy hands and reckoning the dead. So this is just one example, but I just wanted to highlight it because Egyptian art can seem quite inscrutable or incomprehensible if you're not familiar with it. But it does actually have an orientation and its own geography that the artists will use. And once you are able to adjust to that way of thinking or that way of reading these images, you can actually follow the narrative of the battle somewhat artistically. So the battle starts, Ramesses receives news, the Hittite attack on the camp begins, the Narin arrive from the west, Ramesses and his troops launch their counterattack, Kadesh is to the east of the Egyptian camp, Muwatalli starts to retreat, the battle carries on, Ramesses has his victory. There is a way to read this art if you take the time to go through it, which is I just think it's a fun detail. So that kind of brings me to the end of everything. These are just some references for folks who are interested. Otherwise, thank you everyone for joining me, and I hope you've enjoyed it. I'll see you soon.